Anyway, I really,
try it up on the podium.
yeah, I think it's kind of locked in, maybe. Let that go up. It'll be a little easier. All right. I just need to be able to see what's actually you guys are looking at here. Anyway, like Dee said, my name's Tom Parish. I'm actually a Manhattan native. My father taught at K-State for 30-something years, so I was born here, came here a couple years before I was born, and I've just obviously had a real connection to the area, and I've been kind of proud to be able to say that I found something in our area that's actually special to the Flint Hills and Manhattan and just the broader region. Really just about everything that I've done in concerns to like just researching these structures have come out of a photographic project that started as my master's thesis while at K-State, and then was, like Dee pointed out, I was asked to basically create an expanded view of that, kind of push the research further, at least that was my kind of goal with it, and do just a more expansive exhibit at the Beach Museum, which they helped me to receive the Kansas Humanities Grant, which enabled me to take this just way, a lot further. This is a picture from a recent installation up in Kansas City. And each time I've done this, actually put this in other galleries, I've tried to push actually the research part of it further, more than the photographic part. So as I've just kind of, what can I say, become a little bit more obsessed with the topic of these structures and found just how prevalent they were in the area and to the history of the area and how little information was kept about them, it's really just made me just want to keep digging further. And even when I've tried to actually go do something else, it's like I keep getting pulled back. So, but I think that they're incredibly fascinating. I've spent, who knows how many hours, like just looking for them, just whether driving around and looking for humps and rocky outcroppings, or knocking on doors, leaving flyers, and all these other things. Anyway, they just are something that is this almost universal structure that has been adapted for so many things throughout the Flint Hills. But these give you a few examples of how these actually can appear in the landscape. They can be just in rocky outcroppings, kind of, half dug into a hill or on flat ground, or you can find them underneath basements, which obviously is the most difficult for me to find from just driving around looking for them. No x-ray vision. But anyway, these things are honestly a lot of times like the last thing remaining of an old homestead. Even at times an entire town will be represented by just what is more or less kind of this time capsule that's just been kept hidden mostly. This is an example, one of the first ones that I actually found. I doubt anybody would be familiar with Whiskey Lake or Whiskey Point, which used to be like Aggieville before Aggieville for the troops. Used to be a little river, or a little marsh really, that they would have to take a little barge across, and then brothels and bars, and they do whatever they do, and had to dump out the whiskey in the lake on the way back. But this is literally the last thing remaining of that entire town. And it was one of the first places I worked out how I was going to go about shooting these structures, which I really had to adapt to every structure. But pretty quickly, like recognizing just how important these were and how they all seem to have this kind of fingerprint-like presence to them, I decided I wanted to figure out this serial method of shooting them. And so, went from trying to take the best picture of a particular structure, creating the best photo, to creating something that really spoke to the structures themselves. I knew I wanted to make these large prints like I had in the gallery, so anyway, I kind of adapted these, what's really for like creating a virtual tour, but usually like in a landscape, something where you can focus really far off and just let the camera kind of work for itself. But instead, I adapted it to be able to do stuff within, a small like 10-foot by 6-foot room. Obviously, it gets bigger from there, but I would shoot it. This kind of gives an idea of the rows and columns, but each one of these could be at least 2 pictures, if not like around the doorway, upwards of 15 or 20, even, just to get all the information that I can in order to sew these together into something seamless and that really speaks to the structure itself. And this is, it's almost 360 going all the way up and down and side to side, other than maybe like a sewer lid, top and bottom. But anyway, so all the photographs, I've now shot 58 360s, and again, to me, they're kind of this serial thing where you can kind of compare them like portraits of people, or I consider them to be these internal landscapes. But while working on my exhibit at the Beach Museum, it enabled me to create the website that Dee Dee mentioned, which gives a ton more information, which there's no way I can cover it all. I'd love to. I honestly had 45 minutes with the Preservation Alliance, and I think I went an hour and 10. And so 20 minutes, I mean, you guys can start walking out. So it might not happen. But anyway, you know, so this gives you some example of how these can be used in this compare and contrast way. It's also available on the website. Now, each of these, at best, even a 40-inch print, I kind of consider to be a thumbnail representation of the larger image. They can be printed to 25 foot by 15 foot, just absolutely enormous. You can see every little detail. And, you know, there's always been this kind of a sense of, you know, wanting the work to be able to do different things. And this gives an example of what happens when that process that I do to create these large flat prints are in the middle of the process. I use the fixed individual images to create a very seamless, kind of hyper-real 3D virtual reality look at these structures themselves. But anyway, one of the things I was thinking about while I was doing this was just the idea that, you know, someday somebody might actually be able to use my work as a way to study these. I really didn't picture myself being the one to do the studying, but anyway, I've inevitably been that person at the same time working on the art side. But I was lucky that Jack Hoffman, who's an archaeologist with the University of Kansas, who actually does not study this stuff either. He works on Paleo-Indian, like Clovis Indian, you know, not even like recent Native American history, but much further back. He was looking at properties that were, you know, old homesteads in the Republic County area to look for timbers that he could use to like age ruins of different Indian villages, and came across structures like the ones I've come across in the counties I've studied, and couldn't help but be drawn into it. So these ones up top, they represent the Republic County area, and he certainly found a few dozen of them. But really, you know, the Flint Hills, I mean, for multiple reasons, is the real epicenter. I mean, I haven't been proved wrong yet, but the epicenter of where these things really are the most highly concentrated in this form. Obviously, root cellar is a very common thing. But for instance, in the Northeast, one book that I found on the history of root cellars when I was researching early on, a gentleman by the name of James Gage, who researched the topic for 15 years, found all of 6 arched roof root cellars in all of New England. And he called them the rich man's root cellar, the rarest form of root cellar, all this and that. And within 3 months of me searching, I had probably found 50 of them. And by the time I was done with my master's, I had found about 125. And then while working on my grant, I think I got upwards of 300. And now with Jack's help, I think we're close to 400, maybe more. But you can get an idea of just how these are, you know, kind of thick in this area. And I'm sure that at one point there would have been twice as many, maybe several more. But anyway, you know, what is it that makes them so, I mean, so normal to find here in comparison to other places? Some things rather obvious. You know, obviously there's an abundance of stone throughout the Flint Hills. That's part of what makes them the Flint Hills. And just like most of Kansas when it was initially settled, very little timber. This is actually an image from around 1885, but David Fairchild, who was the son of George Fairchild, one of the early presidents of the university, you know, this was his remembrance of the area when he came here at about 10 years old. So, you know, what I learned from talking with Jack is that there were trees, but they were just snatched up so quick for fuel sources that what little bit of timber there was, within the first 10 years it was gone, and then it really was this treeless wasteland. And so there was very little choice but to use stone, and it was a great material anyway. There's a little bit of humor, but, you know, this is honestly the primary way that the wood that was here was used. It was a fuel source. You might use it for the structural parts of a house, but anybody that actually had a wood house at that point probably that was the affluent structure, that was the rich man's structure. They had to, you know, bring that stuff in from St. Louis. The Maria Dahl Church, it was supposed to have been, you know, all that wood was brought in from St. Louis. Like, you know, so there was no dimensional lumber to be found. So with the cultural heritage, which is something that is a bit of a mystery, I mean, there's all kinds of different groups we can talk about settling the area, but there was a lot of Swedes, Czechs, Germans, that all came pretty much straight to Kansas as original immigrants. And this was an important fact that Jack and I have discussed, because these people would have come, you know, from a place where they were basically living in the same situation for generations. There was really no upward mobility. You know, you were probably a tenant farmer, not that everybody was, obviously, but a lot of people were basically stuck in this exact position that maybe their grandfather, grandfather's grandfather were all doing that same basic job. And so when they came here, this was really their first chance to own property. And they looked at it, you know, there was good reason to want to to build permanently, so stone made sense. You know, when trying to find actual European connections to these structures, it can be pretty difficult. I mean, I definitely know, you know, the wine cellars, whether in Germany, that's what the Weinbergen is, or in France, there's definitely a connection, at least architecturally. But these little private root cellars and potentially dugouts, you know, maybe pit houses or these German Einsiedler or hermit huts. But anyway, when we're trying to identify like what is indicative of Swedish or Czech or German, that stuff is really elusive too. Like so much, there's just nothing was recorded. Jack has found a group in up in Republic County that these caves are very identifiable, whether or not it's a cultural thing, this Czech thing, or this family, the Boxa family that actually has, you know, created this style of running the stones perpendicular to the arch rather than with the arch, is a question mark. Anyway, things that we need to be looking into. But these same family, this is a Boxa cave currently in use that is much like, you know, that might have been used even 100, 150 years ago. So, you know, there's really, like I said, there's been very little information that's really been kept on these structures, and that, you know, none of them really show that more than this particular place, which is out south east of Alma, out in this Nature Conservancy area, where I went, you know, and I checked the deeds office. You know, none of the plat maps ever show that identifying mark of a home or a homestead being there. And so I have no record of who this person was. John Olson's just the name, the first name that actually shows up as owning the property. But anyway, I mean, that's 1902. This place was definitely there in the 1860s, 1870s. But again, the earliest plat maps, I mean, just this lack of information during this time period, first plat maps and censuses weren't done until, you know, the 1880s, even midway into them in most places. But this is one that I'm almost sure that this first structure, that structure on the bottom left, which is the cave, was one of these first homes. Just the proximity to the other buildings, it makes perfect sense that way. And you look at the construction of it, it's much more just kind of rough construction, even though it was also, I pointed this out previously, but had the prettiest background nest I've ever seen. It was like potpourri, like all the wildflowers and stuff were brought in. But anyway, you know, this early fascination I had for these structures, and this one illustrates it, was just the fact that these things so quickly like pass out of memory, and just whatever information there at one point was or were, that information is just, you know, I mean, it just ends up being lost. Now, you know, these just are a few examples of ancient structures, you know, that are stone and share a lot in common with these local ones that eventually, you know, far outlive the cultures that built them, and have become just kind of mysteries, which was always this thing that made me think these structures are gonna long outlast any of us and end up similarly mysterious, even they already are. But, you know, another thing that just made it so that these were not something that was really depicted, and we can't find pictures of them, is that the fact that, you know, most of the Flint Hills was settled really 10 or 15 years before photographers started making their way into the area, including Alexander Gardner, shown here on his wagon. That, and, you know, people that are alive today, the only experiences that they have are post, you know, introduction of electricity. And so all the many purposes that these things might have served throughout their lifespan, you know, the experience of anybody that has a living experience or a living memory of it is in a very limited scope, because refrigeration and everything else would have become much more common. So the essential nature of these structures would have been lost. And part of what's happened is just this whole lumping together of things. It's like, you know, I was amazed talking to the archaeologist, the state archaeologist, that when they surveyed a property, they literally had one box on a sheet that just said root cellar, and they checked it. If there was a root cellar present, they didn't describe it in any way, try to determine if it was built first or earlier or whenever. No measurements, no nothing. And so everything got treated the same way, everything got lumped into one category. And then this idea that, you know, people have just kind of steered clear of these, which I understand the, you know, the inclination to not want to go into a dark hole in the ground. It's kind of like pulling up the sewer lid and climbing into it. You know, not too many of us are going to do it. I will say, from having been in over 300 of these, that you know, they're usually a lot more sterile, what can I say, than they might seem. But there are exceptions. But anyway, most times, I mean, I've spent hours in them, and not that I haven't seen anything that's creeped me out or had any surprises, but it's the exception and not the rule. I've seen 2 snakes, which is always what I hear, the very first thing. Watch out for snakes. And in 300 plus, I've seen 2. I've seen more skunks and raccoons and vultures. But then there's few mentions, you know, few things historically really describe this type of structure in specific terms. So this is an example. George Ransom Parker, who his homestead, even though it wasn't his original homestead, was located, or is located, down on Deep Creek Road right next to I-70. This is the excerpt from Pioneers of the Bluestone Prairie, where I found 36 different entries that describe places this way. Anyway, when he got there in 1879, or 1881, I think it was 1879. Anyway, there was already a house started to be built, but it was really just the foundation. And there was a cave already finished that he just, I mean, it was described as having an arched limestone interior with a chimney. And so this was one of the few that I was able to like look at that entry and go and find the structure. So this is the George Parker place. And you know, the fact that it had this chimney in it, the fact that it faces east, it only has a single entrance. It was certainly purpose built as a home, and they lived in it while they built, you know, or at least started to build the main house, which would have been the Taylor family originally. But they moved on actually to Washington before they finished it. So George Parker, which this is another reason why there's misinformation. You know, a lot of people when they came in here, like the second wave of people to come in and settle, and were taking up residence in places that people already had occupied. They didn't have that pride of having built the structure, this fresh feeling, you know, the fresh paint, you know, fresh carpet. You know, you're like, nobody's lived here. And you know, you feel like everything's clean. I mean, people would have felt that way about these structures when they were very first built. I'm very confident. But when somebody came in, you know, that second group that didn't have that experience, they kind of, you know, project the same way we might what their expectations are for that structure. And there's like a creepiness factor that probably wasn't there for that first family. So, you know, anyway, some of the mysteries, and I'm going to try to dive through this. I'm sure I'm well past time already, but anyway, you know, okay, I might be able to do it. Okay, but so, you know, one of the big mysteries, and I mean, there's several that we've been trying to figure out, is the idea of how these were constructed. And when I very first started, you know, researching this subject, and I started talking to locals, people that have been around the areas for a while, I more often than not got the answer, well, when I asked how they were constructed or how they thought they were constructed, that they were built over a dirt mound and dug out. That idea of being dugouts, which according to the author of that root cellar book, and a friend of mine who's a mason, that just wouldn't make sense, because you know, the dirt would suffer from compaction, and you know, the arch would just slump because of it. And so more than likely, and this is actually one that my friend Luke restored out by Alma, using arch forms a lot like you might make a bridge form, something like that. But you know, this is kind of the expectation, and it's more of a, I think, a modern expectation. When I was looking around at these, I mean, some of them, like this one on the right, which was identified to me as a first home, just the way that the nature of the arch itself, like, it just doesn't make sense for having a wood form that's, you know, nice and made up to hold that arch. Would be, I mean, if you looked at both sides together, actually, they're just not even. And they go, the arch goes all the way down to the ground. There's no spring wall where they would have put the arch on top of some other, some stones on the side or whatever. But more recently, Jack Hoffman has done research, which I plan on going out this weekend to check out another cave in Republic County with him to do a dig, which sounds really exciting. But this is one that had previously collapsed, and he had gotten permission to excavate it, and they really just did this, just dug a channel next to it. But some of the features that he was able to point out really go a long way to, make a structure like this one in particular, maybe not in all cases, but just about impossible to have been built over a wood form. Primarily the idea that there's a limestone rubble footing well underneath the wall. It extends like 3 feet below the wall, and it doesn't extend into the cave, it only goes out. And it's, crushed limestone is put at the base. And then, the idea that there's these paving stones being stacked up as it goes, and there's even like historic debris in the trenches that would have been on the outside, which the whole idea was with the wood form is that you dig a trench, you line the inside with walls, and then you put the wood form over it and you stack the rocks on top of that. These two features, the limestone footing and these rough nature of the outside, those bottom walls just wouldn't work that way. You couldn't dig a trench and then dig footers that extend out from the trench, and then when you're lining up you're stacking your rocks, the rough side of this facing out is exactly what you see when you look at the top, like on a wood frame. The outside of the rocks are always these jagged edges. So these jagged edge stones go all the way down to that footer, which to me means they're building on the outside, pushing this, the faced edge of their rock to the inside. But really, one of the important factors is that this form of dugout could have been built with relatively meager tools. This is probably even like a deluxe set, and with just a couple people. Most of the structures we've found, 1 or 2 people could be hefting these stones, and they're very different from the ones that were built with, potentially for Riley contractors, and built these really robust, very perfectly cut stones. But anyway, so their adaptations, the expectation is this root cellar, storm cellar. No matter what, they were definitely this absolutely important, essential part of a farm or a ranch, and that's one of the reasons why, without doubt, I'm confident that they were at least among the very first things that these people wanted to build. They were root cellars. These are actually both on the same property out by Alma, a root cellar and a spring house. This is the root cellar, and this quote, although it doesn't have to do with this picture, is really telling because it uses the words caves and dugouts and describes these things that people went to after having lived in them and using them for shelter later on. It's almost like there's a few of these that are kind of little Rosetta Stones that you're kind of like getting the different ways that these things were described. Anyway, this is the inside of the spring house, which if you look at the arch on these, it's again one of these things that doesn't make sense for wood. If these were built and they look very similar in a time when there was very little wood, why would they not use the same arch form on both? They have very different arches, and there's no good reason not to. But anyway, so the idea of them being dugout homes is something that I think the lack of that has made it so that people haven't paid them any attention. And really, it's an unfortunate thing. This is much more, if you see, this is like 1880 to 1890, much later than these structures around here would have been used as a home, but more typical of what we picture for dugouts. I was amazed just how few times I ever saw pictures of this type of root cellar, even if that's all we're thinking of as, came up when I searched for them, even in the Library of Congress. But one thing I did recognize is that in other areas where you looked up dugout homes and root cellars, they tended to look like interchangeable. They were like the same basic format, and they always made best use of whatever was available in their environment, and there was some kind of cultural flair to them. Now this is a dugout that's out by Osborne, Kansas, and very importantly, it's a stone dugout. And so it goes to show that stone dugouts, that was the thing, which I had no doubt about. But the only difference between this and one of ours is that it doesn't have an apparent arch ceiling. And if you think about that dirt method making it relatively easy to build one that way, and it's really the best way to span a gap with stone, and very secure. It just makes perfect sense. But again, one that in one picture, this exact same type of structure called the dugout home in Greeley, and then this one by Haskell, it's then the Frady hole. So over time they would have had all these different purposes, but that original home was something that was elusive. I know it's really close here. I'm almost done. Is it? Well, just the idea that they were dugout homes. Definitely go to the website and research or look at some of the additional research. This was a place that I actually took a group of students, and just different attendees to a little workshop. And this was one that just amazed me, having actually a bed and a stove that I found in it. And then ones with like 2 rooms and a giant back window, just things that make no sense for a cellar, for a purpose-built cellar. The one picture that might show this type of structure, obviously I can't stick my head in there and tell you if it was arched roof, but anyway, and then just all of these different things that talk about, having lived in a cave for several years while building a main house. There's really some amazing stories. But anyway, I'm going to kind of just wrap it up. A lot of this stuff hasn't made it to the website yet, and hopefully a book might be forthcoming because there's a lot here. But anyway, just the idea, I hope, taking a broader interest in these things. If you guys happen to have any stories or information, please share it. If you happen across one of these, you hear of somebody thinking that they should just bulldoze it or whatever, which has happened all too often, or filled in, maybe say something, at least encourage them to have somebody come look at it, maybe myself, because some of these, like this, these are actually founders of the Oldsburg area. Maria Dahl, that was the original dugout home for the Melgrins. The Sand family out by Randolph, one of the first 6 founders of Flush. According to his great-great-grandson, this was built under the log cabin, which in the history of the Flush area just talks about him building a log cabin and living in it. But he, without me prodding him, volunteered that information as being the original dugout house. This is the original founders of the Abilene area, and this stone dugout is, this is fine. But it's underneath that turret of that building. So anyway. And this is today. There's somebody on Colorado that's living in one of them.
Really?
Yeah. So anyway, well, thank you guys very much. And definitely,
Thank you, Tom. You've opened a door to a fascinating